having a conversation is almost always a good thing. But is it?
Being overwhelmed by the tide that's taking me away from the ability to be overwhelmed by things that could be creating awe,
Just say, like, I'd like to start with hello, that remind people, oh yeah, like we're humans interacting with humans here, and just everybody's just trying to do their best. Sometimes as an organizational leader, your people want to know what you're thinking. They want to know your vision. They want to know what you're hoping for. With humans, as you're interacting with them, a lot of that communication of, I need you to feel free to critique here, is going to be in the unspoken ways that you carry yourself.
Hi, Zadie. Do you ever get the sense that your day-to-day is less about the work itself and more about navigating what feels like a flood of emails or endless meetings or shifting platforms and just this constant pressure to be available? I mean, that sense of being stretched thin, and scattered, and strangely disconnected in spite of being hyper-connected is what my guest today calls digiwhelm. Craig Mattson is a professor, researcher, and author of a fascinating book entitled Digital Overwhelm, a mid-career guide to coping at work. Rather than offering tips to detox or unplug, Craig invites us to rethink the very modes of communication we inhabit every day, from the way we write emails to how we signal meaning through gestures and silence. In today's conversation, you'll hear Craig explain what digiwhelm is and how it shows up at work. We'll explore what he calls mode switching and why it's more than just context switching. We'll talk about the surprising power of one-way communication and why leaders can pay close attention to the signals they send and receive. And before we're done, Craig will even share some ideas of how you can apply not only this stuff at work, but also at home. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into my discussion with Craig about his book, Digital Overwhelm. Hey, Craig, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Grateful to be here, Andy.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. We'll get to some ideas from your book in just a bit, but I'd love for our listeners just to learn more about you. Like, who's the guy on the other side of this microphone, right? Because you share some glimpses in the book of your early life, from your mom's dramatic read-aloud storytelling, which I appreciated, to your dad bringing home a Commodore 64. For me, that was my uncle. So looking back, are there experiences from your family culture or childhood that you think maybe in some way shaped how you approach communication and technology today?
I guess so. I'm a Gen Xer. Are you, Andy, or are you?
I am a late boomer.
Late boomer. Okay.
Yeah.
So as a Gen Xer, I recall what a phone cord is. I remember trying to answer as a 7-year-old, trying to figure out the phone etiquette for the the landline in the kitchen.
For sure.
So I'm between things.
Yeah.
I remember analog life super well.
Mm-hmm.
My experience now is much more, involved in digital spaces. So I think that's probably the aspect of my upbringing that most powerfully shapes how I experience digital overwhelm. I had a life before it.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm. I saw somebody on X just this week said, for those of you that were born, I don't remember what time frame they said, but what did you do when you didn't have a phone and you were bored? I don't know. What do you think, Craig? What did you do when you were bored?
Oh, yeah, that I have actually been thinking about that. What did I do before I had something to scroll with?
Right.
And when I was a kid, I mean, like you mentioned, my mom was an avid reader and she read to us a lot. So story was a huge part of my childhood. And I think when somebody wasn't reading to me, I was telling stories. I told them to myself.
Yeah, right, for
A
sure.
little bit of an odd kid.
Yeah.
But I also told them to friends. And I remember riding around in the back of a pickup with my cousins and telling stories. So I feel like storytelling was something.
Yeah.
So I wasn't scrolling somebody else's stories.
Yeah.
I was kind of concocting them
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
myself and for my friends.
Yeah.
I hope they've all had therapy since then and have
Right.
recovered from those
Probably.
odd narratives. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's something
Yeah.
I hope.
I'm sure I spent much more time outside, and
Yeah.
through play it was a version of story,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
yeah, I mean
Right. Exactly.
we have a phrase in our house that boredom is a choice, and our kids are sick of that, but there is an element of which that a lot of this is about choice, and we'll kind of talk about that in some ways. And what I was curious when before I cracked open your book was this just going to be another digital detox book, because I feel like a lot of books about this are about, log off, stricter boundaries, even escaping tech altogether if possible. So, how would you kind of position Digital Overwhelm, your book, as different from those sort of approaches?
I respect those approaches a lot. I need those approaches a lot. I feel like my life moves in undulations of self-discipline and then like indolence and decadence. And I somehow have to like recover
Right.
those practices of digital detoxing or digital minimalism.
Mhm.
So I have a lot of respect for those. But there are a lot of great books that tell you how to do that.
Yeah.
And I didn't really want to contribute to that literature. There's
Mhm.
plenty to read. You
Yeah.
should just read Cal Newport
Mhm.
or Andy Crouch or something like that.
Yeah.
So, my book is more for people who feel like I don't have the option to leave the digital platforms that I'm on. Like, this is my work. This is where my work happens. I have to remember these 15 usernames and all those passwords, and I have to navigate Workday, and I have to be on, these sundry other platforms.
Yeah.
And so instead of digital minimalism, I recommend something like digital flexibility. The recognition that as humans, we are constantly moving among contexts. And as a scholar at the University of Cincinnati has said, like humans are essentially users and switchers of modes. We are always moving among different modes.
Yeah.
I remember noticing my dad doing this when I was a kid, that
Mm.
he would change his voice a little bit depending on who was on the phone. That's a very simple kind of mode switch. I mean, a code switch in that
Oh
case.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that flexibility is the wisdom that my book is urging.
Mhm. I like that. It's funny. You and I just had some chit chat before we started recording, and I've seen some time where as soon as we go, okay, let's start recording, then all of a sudden, author voice comes on of the guest. Right? They're switching into author mode. Or, since you're a professor,
Yeah,
you probably see somebody the difference between when they're in front of the class versus not in class. Right?
right.
We do this kind of switching, or at home, or
Yeah.
with my I've got 4 grandkids now. It's like
Oh,
it's just interesting how we do
yeah.
this. During the intro, I mentioned your term digiwhelm,
Yeah.
and I know you just made it up, but why do you think that captures something that the usual words like overload or distraction kind of miss?
hmm Yeah, I like that. Contrasting it with overload, because I mentioned Cal Newport a moment ago, and he talks about communication overload, and
Mm,
I think that term does capture an important reality for many of us. I like the term overwhelm for a couple of reasons. One is that it's both positive and negative.
mm,
It's not an essentially bad phenomenon. You can be overwhelmed with joy, for
mm,
instance. You can be overwhelmed with love, and there are times when overwhelm is sort of exciting
mm,
and really great. I contrast it, or I compare it to the experience of being, when I was a kid. I remember swimming in the Gulf Shores, swimming along Pensacola Beach, and I remember being basically up to my neck in this kind of warm blue-green water, and I remember the white sand, and I remember feeling giddy as the waves just kind of like bore me along. That was a good feeling. I was not in control though.
mm.
Sometimes I look back, I'm like, did you ever hear of a riptide, my friend?
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, overwhelm can also quickly become a negative phenomenon.
Mm,
And so I think I like that doubleness in the term, the possibility of both the joy of it,
mm.
but also that sense of this could go south
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
That feels like it names something important. I mean, does that work for you,
It,
Andy?
it does. You also if and I maybe won't get the quote right, but you were influenced by the quote, uh, who said it's there's difference in being overwhelming or be differently overwhelmed. I believe.
Oh, yeah,
What
yeah,
was
yeah.
that quote? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I forgot that I said I had two
Yeah.
reasons for
Yeah.
choosing this term.
Yeah.
And the second reason is that I'm really influenced by a British writer and
Yeah.
theologian named David Ford.
Yeah. That's it.
And Ford is the one who taught me that you can't eliminate overwhelm in human life.
Yeah.
Like you're always overwhelmed by something.
Hmm.
And so the choice is that you can make are to overwhelm better
Hmm.
and to be overwhelmed by something that's maybe it could be larger or maybe it's just a better reality.
Hmm.
So for me as a person of faith, that better overwhelm is by, say, the generosity of God.
Hmm.
I can also be overwhelmed by our historical moment. I can choose to be overwhelmed by what Silicon Valley is coming up with right now in the
Hmm.
latest large language model or something
Yeah.
like that.
Right. Yeah.
And those aren't unreal things,
Hmm.
but I think one choice we do have is like, yeah, what is going to be the defining overwhelm of my life?
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe a little bit more intentionality instead of just being tossed by the waves. Like
Yeah.
I feel like something that's been easy to lose lately, and I don't know if it's just me, Craig, but a sense of awe. Like
Hmm.
we're so used to everything just being like
Hmm.
in my hand or in my pocket. It's so easy to lose that,
Oh yeah.
and 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 I guess that came to mind as I was going through your book of
Yeah.
like there are being overwhelmed by the tide that's taken me away from the ability to be overwhelmed by things that could be creating awe, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wish I'd thought to say that. I really like that insight. Yeah, I think that's what I was hoping for with that notion of overwhelm,
Mhm.
that something like awe
Yeah,
would be possible in it, not
yeah,
just fatigue and
yeah.
exhaustion.
I feel like a lot of the conversation about this being addicted to technology or the distraction talks a lot about context switching.
Hmm.
You're jumping between tasks and tools, and you're less efficient, and
Hmm.
metaphors of that's how computer processors get overwhelmed and slow down. But in your book, you talk about mode switching, and you referred to that
Hmm.
earlier today too. So, how is that similar to context switching, just to help
Hmm.
people understand it, and then different from it? And I don't know, how does it help us to think of it as
Hmm.
mode switching, maybe as a skill instead of just a
Hmm.
distraction?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And honestly, Andy, I don't know if anybody's ever asked me what's the difference between, say, context switching and mode switching. So I'm going to take a provisional stab at this, and maybe if my answer doesn't quite like do it, we
Yeah,
can like work something out
yeah,
together.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I guess I see mode switching as a very relational
Hmm.
process.
Hmm.
So it's a very holistic relational process. Let's put it that way. So, context switching could be like the way when you're playing one of those retro 1980s video games and all of a sudden you move from one screen to another.
Right.
It can be a kind of thin experience. But what I'm hoping for with this idea of mode switching is it's like your whole person involvement in your context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just like your context changes, but your way of relating to it
Mm-hmm.
changes. So, geez, how does that work for you? Does that distinction make sense?
I think so because I think like there's times in your book where you talk about like
Hmm.
cybernetic versus dialogic or whatever. There's like or I feel like there's times where it's transactional versus relational or something like that.
Hmm.
Maybe it wasn't said quite that way in the book, but I feel
Yeah,
like
no,
sometimes
that's right.
context switching can feel transactional. Like I'm
Yeah,
doing email now and I'm gonna quick. Oh, while I'm doing that, I'm gonna check my phone and I'm changing almost like
yeah,
tasks, but it's not necessarily taking a relational frame on it. I
hmm,
don't know. I don't know.
yeah, that's good. That's really helpful. So, I remember one of my interviewees worked for a major video game company, and he said that in his experience of organizational life, there were so many layers to what was going on that he called it stacked overwhelm.
Mm,
There were
mm,
multiple kinds of layers to the work that he was dealing with. So, for instance, there's the stress of trying to develop the plugin for this particular game. That's hard work. It's hard cognition. It's you're using every part of your brain that you can. And then there's the layer of the other person who's working on another part that you can't do your thing till they do their thing. And then there's the layer of, I don't know, what is the customer going to do with this game? Like, there are some people who like burn through games as fast as they can. They play them all night to try to, solve them in 3 days. And then other people experience the games in very different ways. And you have to think a little bit like both those people. So, anyway, I mention this because that trying to relate to your work in a really rich and wise way, a way that's open to multiple perspectives, that is, sort of self attentive and other attentive and work attentive. Like, I think that's the sort of holistic attunement or
Mhm.
attention that this kind of mode switching calls us to. And I'll just say one more thing about this interviewee. I did like a follow-up interview a half a year later, and his job had changed.
Hmm.
He's still in the same company, but instead of like those logistical processes that he was working through, he was now managing a team.
Hmm.
And he said, like, all of a sudden I find that I'm having to care for people's well-being and not just for their productivity.
Right.
And so I could see that he was again making a mode switch in the way he was relating to the job that he did every day.
I like it. What came to mind as you're talking there, Craig, was the last time we bought a car. You know how
Mhm.
it works, where I gotta go talk to my manager. I think keep going back and forth, and we had not met this manager behind the curtain, And when he finally came over, he goes, "Would this number work?" And I just said to him, I like to start with hello, and I feel like he was context switching. He was juggling lots of things. He was like,
Mhm.
"Here's some paper, here's some contracts. All right, would this work?" And he
Yeah,
forgot the relational part of it.
right, right.
And so just that simple question of I like to start with hello, everything changed. Like his
Yeah.
face relaxed, and all
Hmm.
he smiled a little bit, and it's different, right?
That's fun how you activated that for him. Like, I think that sometimes it's just kind of reminding people that you're in a particular human relationship in a moment is enough to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like talking with a person, like a tech support person on the phone. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes you have to be reminded that this person is attending to a whole bunch of other things. You're really frustrated because your router isn't working at the moment, but they're seeing to 10 customers simultaneously and also trying not to get eaten by a chatbot that could do their job more
Right.
efficiently.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
there are these wonderful moments that can happen when you just say, like, I'd like to start with hello,
Hmm.
that remind people, oh, yeah, like, we're humans interacting with humans here, and
Yeah.
just everybody's just trying to do their best.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
I agree. Yeah. You know, I think I told you before we started recording that I feel like some books I can just kind of gulp and other ones I have to sip. And part of this is the word choice, which I really appreciate a book that kind of makes me think. And I
Hmm.
think the word modes is
Hmm.
one of those things that it takes a while to get a sense of what you're talking about. So to help us understand what you mean by that, could we just walk through a recent day maybe in your
Yeah.
life? And
Yeah.
where did you notice yourself inhabiting
Hmm.
one or more of the modes that you talk about in the book? And where did
Yeah.
you maybe intentionally switch to a
Yeah.
different one? That might, I think, help
Yeah.
people understand.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Oh, I love this question. All right. So a mode is an approach, right? It's an approach, it's a posture, it's a way of relating. So
Yeah,
that's what we've been talking
yeah,
about.
yeah.
And if you get stuck in a mode, like, everybody has a posture that can become kind of like you're rigid in it, and you don't like leave it. And because I feel good in this, and everybody else, if they want to relate to me, they're just going to have to do this too.
Mhm.
But, genuinely loving your neighbor as you love yourself is going to require you to sometimes like adopt the mode of the other person.
Right,
Okay.
right.
But your question was, what would this look like in the course of a day?
Yeah,
I actually have an example from something related to my book.
yeah,
So I reached out to a bookstore and asked if I could do a book talk at their store. And it was a local bookstore. Those are kind of fun, and they benefit and I benefit, and so it seemed like a win-win sort of thing.
yeah.
Just like a day or two before, I learned that they weren't having me do a talk. They were just having me sit at a table
Mm,
near the door.
mhm,
Okay, so right away, I felt stress. I
mm.
felt anxiety because I had been expecting one mode
Yeah,
that
right.
I could go up and sort of play the TED talker, go up and like give a mini not exactly a lecture,
Right,
but,
right, yeah.
more of a one-way kind of
Hmm. Hmm.
communication. And when I found out that they didn't have that space available and I was stuck at a table by the door, oh no, I felt distress. I felt a lot of distress about it. I asked them, could I please use that back room? Is there any way that they have like a little amphitheater in the back? And no, they couldn't deal with me. So I had to switch my modes. I had to relate to people in very different ways. And
Yeah.
so I reached out and got some advice from a marketer, and she said, well, here's what you can do. You should shoot a little video of yourself that maybe says what you were hoping to say in your talk.
Hmm.
And then let's make some bookmarks. And let's put a QR code that takes them to that video on those bookmarks. And let's create get one of those big sticky notepads and some markers, and we'll call it the Wall of Digital Overwhelm. And basically, she helped me to create a bunch of different ways to relate to people. So, as somebody came through the door, if they looked really busy and harried, I might just give them a water bottle sticker and say, "Have a nice day."
Hmm.
If they looked like like a little more leisurely, I might say, "Hey, here's a bookmark for whatever book you get today, and there's a QR code there, and it's kind of about this book over here on this table." And then if they wanted to talk, like we might actually move into a conversation,
Yeah.
and that happened.
Hmm.
And so what I had been dreading, um, yeah, actually turned out to be a really interesting
Hmm.
and I want to say richly relational
Hmm.
experience
Hmm.
rather than just me talking at a bunch of people. There
Yeah.
was a lot of interaction
Yeah.
and also a little bit of like sensitivity to the fact that people coming to a bookstore might just be in very different places. So that's an example where I felt the wisdom of mode switching. The modes at play there, what I wanted to do was more of like the unilateral talk.
Right. Right.
What I ended up doing involved some, you know, digital technology with a QR code. It involved very old-fashioned analog technology with a bookmark.
Hmm.
And then also just, yeah, that really interesting technology called the conversation.
Right.
So
Yeah.
moving among those modes took a little bit of energy. I was pretty tired at the end of the night,
Yeah. Well, that's
but
good, right?
it was fun.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
honestly fun.
Yeah. I wonder if I was in that situation and I was being tossed by the waves, if I would have been the author at the door looking disgruntled or disappointed, and you know,
Yeah,
and
it's
instead
easy
of
to see.
a little bit more agency in that, I can switch modes. I'm not a
Yeah,
victim here. Like
yeah.
it's a different way of going about it.
And I mean, your question was really about a day in the life, and I'll just say really quickly, like today, I teach at a university,
Yeah.
and one of the sort of anxious moments for professors is the beginning of the semester. You have a lot of deadlines. You're trying to get syllabi done
Right.
and quizzes prepared and lectures designed and so forth. And somebody had designed a meet and greet for two different departments, and yeah, it took a little bit of energy to kind of push away from my desk and say, yeah, I'm going to go downstairs and chat with people in a department, that's not my own
Hmm.
and meet new colleagues and people I've never met before.
Right.
And then, you're back to your desk after that sort of dialogue, that conversation, and then you've got an email from somebody, and that's a different mode. It requires a different sort of energy and generosity. And then there's this podcast, which
Right.
I jumped on this afternoon, and
Right.
that's another mode.
Right.
But honestly, if people could walk away from this conversation just thinking about their modes, like
Hmm.
what modes do I prefer and feel
Hmm.
most comfortable in? And then, like, what other modes might be a little less comfortable, but still doable and actually good for other people,
Hmm.
I think that would be a win.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep. I feel like email seems like an obvious place where many of us feel some form of digital overwhelm. And
Yeah.
your book, you suggest a shift from seeing email as just information transfer, which it often feels like that way to project managers, to seeing it more as a conversation. So, could you share some examples of what that looks like in practice?
Ironically, I'm going to share an example of what it sounds like.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I found it's useful to think about email, maybe not every single email, Andy,
yeah,
honestly.
yeah,
I don't think I'm I'm not ready to commit to that.
yeah,
But
yeah.
many emails, maybe like every other email or every third email or something. But think about how it sounds.
Hmm.
So think about the voice of the email. If you think about voice, it has at least four dimensions. It has the force with which you're speaking, the volume. Does your email have an appropriate level of volume for what you're talking about? Or are you, in a sense, speaking in a kind of strained, overly loud, maybe too urgent tone? Another aspect of like voicing has to do with how quickly you're speaking.
Hmm.
And in email, that often means like how much it feels like a house of fire, and how much this is like, this is non-urgent. You can take care of this in a couple of days. What are the expectations that are kind of implicit in the way you wrote the email that make it feel like, oh, I got to respond to this right away? So, yeah, in my book, I think through like how we voice our emails,
Yeah.
like how they sound, which some of that stuff is a little hard to notice because you are just in sort of info transmission mode. But if you, yeah, move into a more relational way of thinking about communication, then yeah, I think it helps to use that metaphor of how does this email sound?
Hmm.
What is its voice?
You actually give some really good examples in the book too. In those like images of the different ones, and I don't know how often we anymore use all caps, but sometimes the effective kind
Yeah,
equivalent of what we're writing is all, all
yeah.
caps, or a passing thought without paying attention to the person, just
Hmm.
like a one word or one
Hmm.
sentence thing. I thought
Hmm.
that was an interesting workshop, that edition you had.
Hmm.
You know, I've heard people say you should not write how you speak, or you should write how you speak. And you actually address that in the book. I'm
Hmm.
interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel a little betwixt and between on it. It is a little bit of a ambiguous point for me
Yeah.
because there is a sense in which I think your voice needs to be present in your writing.
Hmm.
And when it's not, it feels AI generated or it feels inauthentic or it feels maybe like you're keeping somebody at arm's length.
Hmm.
But there is, yeah, I mean, there's a legitimate sense in which chatter and hallway conversation is just different. It moves differently, it works differently than email. And there's this kind of nebulous code we have of like what's professional and what's unprofessional. But there's some usefulness to thinking about like what is a good professional formality to have in an email, not because you want to be impressive or because you want to be adherent to some kind of dumb and impersonal code for the workplace, but simply because you want to be respectful of the other person's attention, which you're spending with your email. So, yeah, I do think that your voice should show up. It's really wonderful when people get a sense of like they can hear you
Hmm.
as you write, but not so much so that it feels like you're just auto dictating to your email and just kind of stream of consciousness unfolding your thoughts as they come. That's
Uh,
not such a great voice, and it's not so
uh,
considerate.
Instead of just texting people, I'm much more now leaving voice notes because I feel like I don't have to worry about, going back and editing words and things like that. And the upside of that is I feel like it's faster and you hear the person's tone of voice, right? So I think it's a little richer. The downside is sometimes it turns into like a 5 minute thing. And so I do it primarily with friends who I know they do it back. But if I had to land on one side or the other, I think, Craig, I would land on write the way I speak because it's more clear that it's not AI or like
Hmm.
like I don't say to somebody as per my previous message. Like I don't say that, right? And so can I say like, hey, you remember when we talked about this last week? I just want to follow up on that. It just feels like
Yeah,
that catches at least a little bit more what you're talking about in the book, I think.
yeah, I think so. I like your impulse. I like your intuition there. I think there's some passive aggressiveness that gets like disguised very lightly in those sort of corporate phrases, as per my recent
Mhm.
email. Like,
Right.
it's like, you idiot, didn't you read what I sent you last time? Is sort of what's being said there without being said.
Right.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
I like the frankness and candor of just human speech.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. It's a lot of fun.
Well, and I didn't you have an example in the book now where if that person was right in front of you,
Uh-huh.
would you say it that way?
Uh-huh.
Like
Yeah, I
like
think that's useful.
embody that. Like if
Yeah.
and so I think I don't know that whole section made me think a lot because we spend so much of our time that way. But so much
Yeah.
workplace advice is beyond email, just it's dialogue and consensus, and that's all good. But
Uh-huh.
you talk about dissemination, and I thought it might be
Mm,
interesting to get a concrete example of what you
mm,
mean in the mode of
mhm,
dissemination in action, and maybe
mm,
from your own experience or someone that you interviewed, where this kind of like I took it as kind of like this bold one-way message. It made a difference, even
mhm.
without back and forth.
Yeah. That was a surprise to me, I confess, in my research, was just how many times people were a little frustrated with what they called the all the back and forth.
Hmm.
There, like there's an impulse in me to say, like, it's good to have back and forth. There's equity, there's responsiveness, there's reciprocity.
Hmm.
I say something, you listen, and then you say something back, I listen, but yeah, there is a sense in which it can be a little exhausting, it can be a little time consuming. And so, yeah, just for fun, I said, like, what if these one-way broadcasts modes that are sometimes criticized. They're often looked down upon because it's unilateral. It's seemingly less respectful, less of a dialogue. Um, but yeah, like what is the virtue in it?
Hmm.
What's the good in it? And there's an author named John Durham Peters who has said that uh, dialogue has an almost sacred place in our values and our practices. Having a conversation is almost always a good thing. But is it? And so, like, are there moments when a definitive, well-crafted email is actually a more generous and important kind of communication? So that's what I was exploring. So where have I experienced that? I can think of two ways that this might be important. So one would be sometimes it's important to let those who are working on your team allow them room to make a one-way broadcast, to just say a thing they need to say. I remember one interviewee saying that sometimes it felt to him when he got into mid-level management that sometimes he needed to let somebody talk for 45 minutes, and that was all he needed to do, was just let them broadcast.
Hmm.
And it's time consuming and it's also emotionally challenging. I think the Edwin Friedman talks about differentiating, self differentiating, not letting the other person's emotions kind of colonize you. And in that moment of broadcast, like that's hard to do, but that person might need to just get that out and then that might fix it, honestly. The other thing to think about is just like sometimes as an organizational leader, your people want to know what you're thinking. They want to know your vision. They want to know what you're hoping for. And I think that those sort of disseminations, which is a fancy word for scattering,
Hmm.
when you just scatter this message out to the company, that can actually be a courageous and generous action, especially if you're helping people understand where you think the company or the organization's going.
Yeah. That's, by the way, you gave great free marriage advice there. Sometimes just listen, right? Sometimes that's all that's necessary. Where were you 37 years ago? But back when my wife and I were dating, I just had the hardest time sometimes dealing with the emotional side of communicating it. It was something that had not been refined or developed. And so sometimes we found that, because this is before email, if I would just write a letter to her,
Mhm.
which was a form of dissemination, I think.
That is.
It wasn't asking for dialogue in the moment, but I
Mhm.
felt like I could get my thoughts across. And we laugh about it now, But
Mhm.
but it is interesting how sometimes maybe we have the equivalent of I need to write the letter
Mm.
to my boss about something I'm concerned about
Yeah.
because in the moment I might not say it the way I need to say it. I don't
Yeah.
know if that's a version
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah. Conversations are wonderful because they're unpredictable.
Hmm. Yeah,
You don't know where they're going to go exactly.
yeah.
But they're also like if you do have a thing you need to say,
Mhm.
they're not always, yeah, that unpredictability isn't always welcome.
Yeah. There's so many modes we're not going to talk about, but I thought it would be fun to take one more. Signaling things. That was one of them.
Uh-huh.
And I
Yeah.
understood that as understanding that communication isn't only about the words we say, but also about the
Hmm.
gestures. And
Hmm.
interestingly, you make the point about the silences, like the things not said at all, and
Hmm.
performances, which is phrasing I hadn't really kind of thought of in that sort of way
Hmm.
that actually make things happen. So for
Yeah.
someone leading a project, what might be some signals that maybe they should be
Mm,
paying attention to from their team? And
mhm,
maybe on the flip side, what kind of signals do we send sometimes without even realizing it?
mm. Whoa. Whoa, that's great. Yes, you nailed it. Like the signaling is a mode that it involves the communication of things unsaid,
Mhm.
things enacted, things done. There's a wonderful book that was written in the 1950s called How to Do Things with Words.
Hmm.
And the book is a little hard to understand, but that title is worth just having on your shelf to remind yourself that your words do things.
Mhm.
They're not just carriers of content. They are also means of conduct. Like they're a kind of behavior. And so paying attention to the signals in your organization means paying attention to all the things your communication is doing. And like you said, that might be your language, but it might also be your gestures, it might be your comportment, your bodily attitude. And this becomes really tricky in digital spaces as well, where there's a kind of flatness to our interactions. You and I are well, we have a weird situation here. Like if we want to appear like we're looking at each other, we have
Uh,
to look away from the
uh,
other person's eyes and like look at the little green dot or
right.
whatever on the webcam.
Uh,
And so, yeah, just thinking about the signaling that we do in a Zoom meeting, for instance, that we're interested, or I was just in a conversation with another person who does work on intergenerational research, and at certain points, like her hand would fly up and she would like lean towards her webcam, and there was like a communication of like, I really care about this stuff.
uh,
So yeah, I think the story I told, one of the stories I told was about a woman who was working on a nonprofit and they were doing some like, workplace development stuff related to race and difference. And yeah, she found herself at a certain point. I think she was in a Zoom room with, she's a black woman. She was in a room that was predominantly white, and yeah, she was overcome emotionally by something that was being shared in the workshop, and none of her coworkers were. And so she had to like go off camera for a moment, kind of collect herself, and then come back on and figure out, okay, how do I carry myself in this meeting? And that was a kind of negotiation of like almost like in a relational space, like I'm having a different experience of this than everybody else here seems to be. So I don't want to disrupt that, but at the same time, I need to be who I am in this space. And so, yeah, she figured out a way to kind of signal that maybe a little bit of a gap between her coworkers and herself by just how she comported her face.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think you asked, like, how do we pay attention to those signals? And I think it's a little bit of like there are two channels in a microphone cable
Uh,
or something, and
yeah.
I think we're paying attention to the information that's being passed, but we're also paying attention to the feelings that are present in an interaction. How does that work for you? Like thinking about the sort of the two channels,
Mhm.
like there's the data and then
Yeah.
there's also the feelings.
Yeah. No, it's a great question because I spend most of my days not doing this. Most of my days in front of a group of people teaching workshops or keynotes or at Loyola's Business School in Chicago. And so you know this for what you do as well, that when you're on Zoom, you can't pick up as well that person has a question. But when you're in the room with them, you can kind of see they haven't said anything, but they're signaling they've got a question, but they don't know quite sure if they want to ask it. And so you
Yes.
can go, Craig, what are your thoughts on this? Right?
Yeah.
You can draw them in. And so part of me
Yeah.
feels like I'm if I'm not careful, I listen to the words and I miss the music. I miss the the,
Hmm.
the room tone. And
Hmm.
if I ask a question in a meeting, like anybody have questions? And if there's be like a thought bubble above my head, it'd be like, dear God, please, no questions. Like, okay. And yet that silence of the lack of a question
Hmm.
might have been a signal, right?
Hmm.
That I'm moving too fast, or
Yeah.
they think I don't want to hear, maybe,
Hmm.
or they're afraid to speak up. Any thoughts about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I love that. I love that example of just being aware when someone's on the brink of a question
Yeah.
and maybe they don't even know themselves how to ask it.
Mhm.
So maybe the biggest piece of advice here is kind of from what you just said, and that is make room for that. Like
Mhm.
slow down enough to allow the signals to take shape and then to pick up on that signaling.
Mhm.
Um, people don't they so often we don't know what we think,
Yeah.
and we just need room to let this stuff take shape, and sometimes that's going to begin with signaling. I
Mhm.
think we can also signal things like I don't have time,
Yeah.
I don't want to talk, I feel too fragile about this idea, I don't want any disagreement. Lately, I've been thinking about how we could use artificial intelligence to like find blind spots in our own ideas.
Mhm.
And it's funny. You have to tell the AI to be a critic
Mhm.
because it's so
Right.
like it's designed to please. It's
Great
designed
question,
to.
Craig.
That's the most brilliant idea of the
Right,
21st century.
exactly. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
like, no, I need you to find fault
Mhm.
with this idea.
Mhm.
And but with humans, as you're interacting with them, a lot of that communication of I need you to feel free to critique here is going to be in the unspoken ways that you carry yourself.
Yeah. The way they carry themselves, that's another signal, right? And uh, I'm thinking of somebody who he went to a meeting with a number, it was a large gathering, but one of them was a very famous leadership author. And he was really excited to meet the person. But he said while he was speaking with that person, it's almost like his eyes were always looking over his shoulder. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the part of my question about what
Yeah.
do we need to be aware of with our signals?
Hmm.
And you kind of alluded to that as well, is are we signaling we're too busy? Are we signaling
Hmm.
we don't have time? And I won't say this haunts me as a father and as a husband, but I think a lot of this
Hmm.
applies there too, right? What am
Hmm.
I signaling? Am I signaling that my mind is really on something else, or am I here and present? Right? That's a
Yes.
big deal.
So well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's just another example of a chapter that if people sip it,
Mhm.
I think there'll be plenty for her to walk away from.
I
Yeah,
hope so. Yeah.
there's so much more we could talk about, but let's end with this because many of our listeners aren't just project managers or leaders; they're also parents or spouses or caregivers. If you think about the modes that you've described in your
Hmm.
book, can you think of one or two practices you've tried in your own family? Because I understand from your book, like I think your kids are grown and out of the house now. If I caught that right, but
Yes, you're
that
right.
maybe even use as a husband, or you use then to help cope with digital overwhelm at home.
Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for being such a good reader of my book. It's very flattering to have somebody remember the particulars of your own book.
You made it easy to do that.
I think I learned about mode switching at the dinner table for
Mm.
sure. When our kids were small, uh, dinner table's chaotic, and I remember thinking my son would never stop standing in his chair. Like that would just be for the rest of his life. He'd be standing and
Right.
protesting whatever's on the table. And I remember feeling this intense need to like communicate what had happened to me that day. And my spouse might be feeling a similar need to share a story from like what she had experienced at work. And so we'd be like, we would like institute like a space of quiet, like mom and dad need to talk for about 10 minutes here. So everybody just eat your food and then we'll open things up for Q&A. Yeah, and that would so often break down. And that dialogue that we were sort of hoping for in the moment, just like one on one, face to face, it's really precious and beautiful and important. But sometimes the more beautiful thing was to open it up
Mm.
and allow other people to kind of engage it. And, kids will say the weirdest things
Mm.
and help you see connections that you just weren't seeing. And so I feel like the dinner table was one place where mode switching was something I had to learn in order to survive.
Yeah.
We can't just have a dialogue right now. We got to have a multi-log. It's got to be all of us
Hmm.
contributing to this conversation.
Yeah. And I think part of your book is not just I'm going to switch to this mode as much as notice what mode I'm in, maybe like
Yes.
be and
Right.
of course, with emotional intelligence, I think the hardest part is self awareness.
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
with this too, of like realizing that. Like, it's been a long time since my wife has said this, but it's happened in our marriage where she's like, honey, I'm not your stakeholder. you know, it's like, I need to notice that this is not project management here. That, my wife's not my stakeholder. And
Yes.
I, I, I
Yes.
I think also, Craig, I guess maybe we covered it, but the signaling at home, because
Hmm.
just like with self-awareness, it's not just the words we say as a parent or as a spouse, it's the how did we say it? And
Hmm.
was there a little bit of uh, some music of disgust in the way I looked, even though that's not what I
Hmm.
meant, And
Hmm.
so just being
Yeah.
aware of that. So,
Yeah, like the score or the soundtrack to our
right,
conversations, paying
right.
attention to that.
Yeah,
I
the
mean, I
lyric.
think
Yeah.
just to add one more thing to that, I think there is the signaling that we do. There's that underscore that's going on all the time. But our tools are also shaping that. And
Mm,
I now relate to my family pretty heavily through digital tools because my kids are scattered around the
mhm,
Midwest. And so, yeah, thinking about how to offer support, how to offer celebration, how to offer "How are you doing?" questions, and how to kind of share funny stories, like all of that stuff. Our tools shape and affect the ways that we're able to do that. So I think for families too, and not just for
mhm,
project managers,
mhm.
there's an importance to just paying attention to like what does this tool afford, what does that one afford, and just being aware that our tech is doing stuff to our conversations.
Yeah, well said. For those listening, we've just barely touched on what's available in Craig's book. If you'd like, I think, a uniquely thought provoking perspective to
Hmm.
address the digiwhelm in your life, I recommend you get a copy of Digital Overwhelm. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. Hey, Craig, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
I was grateful for the chance to swap stories and enjoy some good laughs. Thanks, Andy.
Special thanks to Craig for joining us here on episode 484 of the People and Projects podcast. I mentioned it briefly during the recorded part of the interview. He and I had some discussion before the interview as well. And I, I feel like just a lot of the books that I go through each week, you know, sometimes it feels like it's the same thing, something else that's maybe a different angle on it, and easy to gulp down the book, read it pretty quickly. And this is one of those that I think I would have preferred to start reading earlier. And the way I said it to Craig was, it's a book you want to kind of sip or savor. Like, what does he mean by this? Because I think you could even get to the end here and go, I'm still not quite sure what those modes are or what the mode switching is. Uh, I think there's plenty from the interview that would provide value. If you want a kind of a thoughtful, like a different way of looking at whether it's digital technology or communication, uh, I would say emotional intelligence as well. Communication for sure. This is a good book for that. It's a thoughtful book written by an academic, and he'll use words that I think at times will make you go, huh, I wonder what that means. But I like books like that that make me kind of think, where I have to stop and go, I wonder. But I think he also has like workshops in it, which is his way of saying it's almost like a half chapter of actions to take. And I think they're all practical. So there are ways to apply this in practical, you can understand the approaches in practical ways. So I'd love to know if you end up getting a copy, let me know. And you can reach me at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. And whether it's from the book that you pick up or just today's discussion, let me know what you connected with or any questions you have. If you like more on this topic, I put links in the show notes to 3 episodes. One is episode 144 with Cal Newport. Craig mentions Cal in the book, as well as he mentioned Cal during the interview today. It's an episode about his book Deep Work, which I think it's a really good companion episode to listen to after this one. Also, episode 269 with Nir Ayal. He wrote a book called Indistractable. How can you be less distracted? And he shares perspectives that I think if you read it, you'll look at your day to day environment differently. And then finally, episode 377 with Cassie Holmes. She wrote a book called Happier Hour. And you could say that it's a time management book or a priority management book, but it gives some exercises that I still call back to years later after reading the book. That's episode 377 with Cassie Holmes. You know, in the intro, I mentioned our Lead 52 newsletter. We've got leaders all over the world that are using that, and it's free leadership training. If you're not part of it, part of that community, you know what? You just get an email every Monday. You can read it in about 5 minutes or less. There's some things to think about. In fact, our whole global community is thinking about it over the course of that week. And then I give you a little short follow-up on the Friday with comments from other Lead 52 members. You can go to getlead52.com and sign up for it. You can unsubscribe at any time. I highly recommend it. You know, I know a lot of you listen to this because you're earning your free PDUs because you already have a PMP certification. But you know what? If you're listening and you haven't gone for your PMP yet, and yet you think you might, or you just want to level up the ability of your team and your organization to, run projects, typically what we're doing is we're running programs in-house at companies. We'll do it open enrollment too, but if you're thinking about exam prep or you just want to help your organization get better at delivering projects, send me a message at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. I love to have an opportunity to work with you and your team. Thanks. Well, if you haven't left a review for the People and Projects podcast lately, I'd love it if you do that. And I just want to say, with all the options you have of listening to podcasts, thank you so much for carving out time to join us here. On behalf of me and my team, thank you so very much.